Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 5. We're officially 1/3 of the way through the course, so things are moving along really fast. One quick announcement before we talk about this week's material: we have quiz 2 coming up. I will post it on Friday morning at 7 o'clock, and it will be due on Saturday at midnight. It'll be a combination of multiple choice and true-false. You guys can refer to the material if you want. The quizzes are open book. So look for that. If you guys have any questions or problems with that, let me know. Okay, so last week we looked at the Crito, right? Plato's Crito. And the topic for the week was the rule of law, right? So this kind of follows up on our discussion about justice last week, where we were looking at sort of Thrasymachus' view of justice as, what is just is for the weak to follow the strong and the strong to do what's in their best interest. And the Athenians sort of making the same argument, but making it rather on an individual level, as Thrasymachus was doing, making it on a state scale, like, internationally, different states have the right, whichever state's the most powerful are just in carrying out what's good for them, right, essentially. So that sort of brought us to the central question of not only what is justice, which is a very complicated question, right? But the real question is, at least as we're concerned, is who decides what's just, right? So in Thrasymachus' case, it was the strong that decided. Thrasymachus and the Athenians' case, it was the strong who decided what was just, right? Well, here we, and also I want to say that it's not just another point that that Socrates made, was that we're not just talking about, when we say just by the powerful, we're not talking just about dictators, but it could even be democratic governments, right? Like, so the strong in a democratic society are the majority of the people, right? So don't just associate it with like a tyrant. It can be the tyranny of the majority, right? So what other options do we have, right? Because it seems like that sort of puts the majority of us, right, unless we're living in a democratic society, which even if we are, there's a pretty large minority that's in bad shape, right? If we're relying on the strong to decide what's just and what's the best for the strong is going to be not the best for the majority of people. So how do we get around that, right? How do we live in a society that seems more beneficial to to the majority or to all of the citizens, right? We'd like to think that all citizens are treated justly and equally under the law in our society. How do we do that? Well, that's where this concept of rule of law comes in, right? And that's what Socrates is getting at, especially in the second half of this particular dialogue. So a little bit of background. We're reading this. Usually when you're reading Crito, you're reading the Apology as well. How did Socrates end up in prison? I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story, right? But so Socrates was this, public philosopher, right? And he would hang out in sort of the city square, and he would always, engage, these people who claimed to be sort of in the know, right? People who were the power, the officials, things like that. Socrates said, hey, come over here. Let me talk to you a little bit about. You say you know what it means to be courageous. Well, let's figure that out. You say what a good immigration policy is. Let's talk about that, right? And Socrates is often referred to as the gadfly that was on Athenian society, right? He said that it was his purpose to attach himself to the state, which was often sluggish, and shock it into action, right? So he would do things that were often shocking to the people that were in power to try to bring about what he thought was the way that the Athenian society should function. As you can imagine, that wasn't very popular with a lot of the people who were in power. Like, imagine let's just say I were Socrates, right? And I got into a conversation with Donald Trump about immigration reform, and I questioned some of his opinions and things like that, or any of the people who were in power, right? They probably wouldn't be very happy with me, especially if I were like doing it in a public forum and demonstrating, that their positions were kind of stupid or kind of silly, right? So Socrates made a lot of enemies, as you can imagine. There was a period when Athens was sort of conquered by Sparta. So our good friends, the Spartans, Lycurgus returns. And the Spartan government put So rather than the traditional democratic society that Athens had once Sparta conquered them, they put into place an oligarchy, which became known as the 30 Tyrants, right? And while they were in place, obviously Socrates was not happy, and he made a lot of enemies, right? And sort of on the heel of those 30 tyrants taking over Athens, and right as sort of Athens got its democratic society back, that's when Socrates was put on trial. And he was put on trial for he had two charges brought against him. One was corrupting the youth, right? So he's got all the young people out here he's talking to, and giving them all these radical ideas about justice and the way society should work. And the other was that he was impious, or sort of, you could call him a heretic, right? So that he didn't believe in the same gods that the city of Athens claimed to believe in, which is ironic when you consider the way that he both opened and closed the Crito was saying, may God's will be done, essentially, right? God's will is going to happen. So it seems a little ridiculous. One thing that is interesting to note that does play a part in this, and it's discussed in this dialogue, is that Socrates, in the Apology, he actually, and when he was on trial, before he was sentenced, they gave him the option of being banished or exiled, and he refused, just like he refused in this particular case, right? Because he said, I had lived my entire life under Athenian laws. I'm an Athenian citizen. I don't want to be banished, right? So he actually chose. So it wasn't just this time where he chose not to escape, but even during his trial, he chose death over exile. And it is sort of made clear in this dialogue, but for those of you that don't know, that Socrates was put to death one day after this scene happens in the prison with Crito, right? And the way that he died was by committing suicide. They forced him to drink hemlock, which is a type of poison. There's a very famous painting of Socrates. He's drinking the hemlock and pointing up, saying that even though I'm being things are not working out well for me here, I'm being what's the word I'm looking for? There's wrong being done against me. I will be glorified. When I move on to the next realm, right? He'll realize my justice, and he doesn't care about, and he brings this up several times. He doesn't care about the opinions of the many, who went against him, but he cares about the opinion of the person who is just and the person who knows the right thing to do. Okay, so he's in his cell sleeping, right? And Crito, a friend, lets Crito into the prison, and Crito's, he's there with him, and when Socrates wakes up, he says, "Hey, Crito, what are you doing here?" And Crito says, "Well, I'm very sad. I know that you're going to die, and the ship is coming. When the ship arrives, you're going to have to drink the hemlock. And I just want to let you know I've got this great escape plan, for you to get out of here, right?" And he, thinks this should be great, and you should be overjoyed. But Socrates, of course, was not overjoyed, right? And I asked you guys in the discussion, how many people thought Socrates' decision was the right thing to do, and how many people would have actually followed Socrates' plan? And of course, virtually nobody. Nobody was willing to, fall on their sword as Socrates did. Right? There aren't too many Socrates out there who's willing to, give up their life for their philosophical principles, which is a reasonable position. But anyway, so Socrates says no. I can't do it. I have this voice in my head that just keeps nagging me. And, I don't want to die, right? He says, I don't want to die. I'm not excited about dying. But, if I leave, I have this voice in my head that tells me that I would be, a huge hypocrite, right? And Crito's like, well, yeah, I understand. And I understand that you're worried that, bad things might happen to me and might happen to your friends who tried to smuggle you out. But I want to let you know I've got that covered. We're not worried about that. And Socrates said, yeah, that was a concern of mine, but that wasn't my primary concern. And he even says, I can't remember which page it's on, but in the dialogue he says that, loss of character, the duty to your children, which Crito brings up later that you might feel that's a reason that you should escape so you can take care of your children, injury to your friends. He calls all these these are false reasons for him actually to to stay and be executed, right? They make sense, they're extrinsic, you could say, reasons for him to escape. But he says that those aren't getting to the fundamental reason why he has to stay. And he says that all these reasons, these outside circumstances of what would happen to my friends, what would happen to my family, etc., he says those are all things that the many or the multitude would agree on is the right thing to do. But what I'm doing based on a conception of justice that I have, right? And so this conception of justice that Socrates has to do with the social contract, right, that he has as an Athenian citizen, right? And that's the really interesting part, is the second half of the dialogue, where Socrates is having this dialogue with the laws themselves, right? The laws, if the laws could speak, you can imagine if justice could have a dialogue with Socrates, this is what justice would say, right? And they said that, look, we sanctioned the marriage that brought your mother and your father together, which allowed you to be born. We put the laws into place to educate you, right? Essentially every benefit that you've enjoyed while you've been alive has been provided by Athenian society. And what is Athenian society? Athenian society is just the laws that keep the Athenian society in place. So they argue that, if Socrates breaks this particular judgment, right, that he should die, right, he should be put to death, then he is essentially aiming to destroy Athenian society, right, and the Athenian society that he spent his whole life defending. And they say, you were the greatest advocate of Athenian life, right? You never left. You had plenty of chances to leave outside of when you were in war, but you decided to stay because you loved it so much, and you spent your entire life defending Athenian society and Athenian democracy. But now you're saying when things don't go your way based on the society that's set up, it's okay for you to leave, right? That's kind of what Crito is saying. And it's kind of like that old, like you're a little kid, right? I mean, the rules are great as long as they benefit you, but of course when the rules don't benefit you, the system doesn't benefit you, say, okay, well, I'm not going to pay attention to that rule, right? And they're saying, look, that's not the way rule of law works. That's not the way society works. And the laws say to Socrates, you have two obligations, right? When you're living in a society, you can follow the dictates of that society and be a good citizen, or you can try to convince us, the society, that the laws are unjust, and we can change those laws. Or you can leave, right? That's what they say. You didn't have any obligation to stay here, but you willingly chose to stay here and participate in our society and sort of follow our laws. So it's pretty unfair of you, right? It's unjust of you to, now that things haven't worked out in your favor, right, to leave, right? Because that would be like weaseling out of a deal, right? You make a deal, you sign a contract with somebody, and you agree to do these particular things, and if there's one sort of stipulation that doesn't work out to your benefit, you welch on the deal, right? You decide not to follow that aspect of it. That's not the way contracts work. That's not the way deals work, and that's not the way that a just and moral man, as Socrates, claims to be and was. That's not the way that somebody like that should behave. And then they talk about all the negative consequences, right? You can escape. You can add a few years to your life, right? But wherever you go, if it's a just society, they're going to look at you as an enemy, right? Because not only when you're injuring Athens as a society, you're injuring the fabric of any society that exists, because for society to exist, there have to be, at least a just society, there have to be rules that are in place that dictate the way that society actually functions. So when you've already identified yourself as somebody who's going to welch on the contract and break the rules whenever they don't benefit you, then you're not a citizen, right? You're not somebody that they would want in their state, right? And they say, of course, you're going to do injury to your family, you're going to do injury to your friends. You're doing injury to your family because you're denying them Athenian citizenship, which is, according to Socrates and, all the Athenians thought it was the greatest society out there, right? So why would you deny that to your family? Sure, you may be able to spend more time with them, but is that going to be more effective than, giving them all the benefits of Athenian citizenship? So for all these reasons, Socrates says, look, I can't do it. Right? I've lived my life trying to be a model of justice and virtue, and if I disobeyed this would be the greatest injustice that I could possibly do, right? Maybe outside of an injustice towards the gods, but Socrates talks about the state is your parents, because your parents may not exist without the state. One of the greatest things you can do is breaking the social contract when it doesn't benefit you. You want to benefit from the society, right? And I mean, it kind of goes along with, we'll talk about this a little bit in the course, I guess, but if you're looking at sort of moral theory, there are two major schools of ethical thinking. One is called consequentialism. So essentially you judge the action that brings about the best consequences is judged as the morally right thing to do. Right? So maybe we think about, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? And we say that, it was, by killing 200,000 Japanese, we saved 2 million American Japanese lives. Right? So therefore, it was the right thing to do. So that's one school of thinking. The other school is called deontology, right? Or categorical ethics, it's sometimes called. And that school of thought says that no matter what the consequences are, there are certain things that you just can't do, that are just not right to do. And, dropping the atomic bomb on 200,000 people is just wrong, right? 200,000, sometimes innocent, mostly innocent people. So, and Socrates falls into that category, right? He says, yeah, I mean, maybe the consequences would be okay for me, even though he calls that into question as well. But he says, look, this is a principle that I just can't hold up to and can't condone. So he's saying that this rule of law is important, right? And that's the answer to the question that I posed in the beginning. If the strong are not deciding what is just, what does it decide what is just? Well, the laws, right? We come together and we agree on a set of laws, a constitution, and we say this is going to be our standard of justice, right? And that's what rule of law is. It's not, the person who is in power decides what the right thing to do. It is that we have as a society an agreed upon set of rules and laws that we follow as just. And Socrates is appealing to that here, saying, if we want the society to exist, then we have to follow these rule of law, have to follow these laws. And that's what the social contract is. So anyway, that's why Socrates decides not to escape. And that's, one way of getting around this question of, Thrasymachus' objection that, the strong are the ones who decide what's right or wrong. Of course, there are problems with that, and we'll get into those too. But it certainly seems better and more just to have an agreed upon set of laws or principles that decide what is just rather than the flavor of the month, right? So anyway, this week we're moving on to Aristotle. We're going to be looking at happiness, right? The pursuit of happiness. What is happiness? And Aristotle's going to give us his opinion of what he thinks happiness is and how you achieve it. So I posted an announcement that says the selection I want you guys to read from Aristotle. Not too long.